This video is sponsored by Skillshare. Hey, welcome to 12 Tone. A couple years back, I made a video called How to Write a 4-Chord Loop, where I took a look at one of the most maligned aspects of modern popular music and explained why they're actually really interesting and useful. It's a good video and I stand by it, but recently I was reading a book by Theorist Philip Tagg who has a completely different way of looking at 4-chord loops. It's a really interesting approach, so I figured that since thousands of hit songs have used these loops, I can probably justify making a second video about them. Let's go! To understand Tagg's approach, it might be helpful to look at a slightly simpler concept first, the chord shuttle. This is his term for a progression that just goes back and forth between two chords. His primary example is Pink Floyd's Great Gig in the Sky, which spends over half its runtime alternating between G minor 7 and C7. Now, one of the first questions a theorist might ask when looking at this groove is, which key is it in? And the answer isn't easy. Tagg proposes four possible interpretations. First, it could be in something like G minor, in which case this is 1 going to 4. That means we're starting on the root and then venturing off to a less stable sound. The second option is that we're in C, making this a sort of 5-1 with our resting place happening on the second chord. Third, it's possible neither of them is the root. Jazz players might recognize this progression as a classic 2-5, implying a resolution to F that we just never actually get. And finally, we could be in B flat because that's the chord the rest of the song mostly resolves to, in which case this is 6 and 2. So which of those is correct? Well, Tagg argues that none of them are. Asking what key we're in is asking the wrong question. By looking for a single tonal center, we're assuming the progression has a specific structure, one with a clear linear direction, but if you listen to the song, it kinda doesn't. To my ears at least, neither chord really feels like it wants to go anywhere. To quote Tagg, the chord shuttle is not a place you pass through en route to another destination. It is itself somewhere to be. That is, what matters here isn't what each chord wants to do next. What matters is what those chords are doing right now. We're not in G, C, F, or B flat. We're in the harmonic space that exists between the chords G minor 7 and C7. That's it. The two chords are effectively opposite poles within a single tonality, like a sort of musical superposition between the two roots. This puts Tagg in sharp contrast to the more classical model of functional harmony. When I talk about this on the channel, I usually say it's the idea that different chords in a key have different functions or jobs to do. That is, they tend to behave in specific, predictable ways. Tonic function chords provide a sense of rest, subdominant chords disrupt that rest, and dominant chords point you back to that rest. In classical harmony, we expect these three functions to fit together into strong patterns of tension and release, with clear resolutions to mark out the boundaries of our harmonic home. But I'll take this a step further. In some kinds of classical theory, it can be useful to think of chord functions not as behaviors, but as positions. That is, if you have a certain cadential structure, the slots within that structure will tell you which kinds of chords are allowed to go there. Like, one of the most common structures in classical music is what's called the authentic cadence, which is a dominant chord going to a tonic. Now, in this case, the dominant is almost always the 5, and the tonic is always the 1, but viewing it first in terms of chord functions instead of actual chords helps to better model their behavior. You can think of it as the difference between this chord is the 5, so it's probably dominant, and this chord is dominant, so it's probably the 5. This may seem like a really fiddly distinction, and it is, which is why I usually don't bother with it, but thinking of function in terms of position is going to be super helpful in understanding Tagg's approach. When it comes to modern music, though, functions can get a bit blurry because composers are no longer following the same rules that Bach and Mozart did. Those clear functional progressions often sound corny and dated these days, so artists have found new ways to drive their songs forward. For example, we've seen a significant rise in the use of the plagal cadence, which is the resolution from 4 to 1. The 4-chord is subdominant, which means that classically speaking it doesn't really point back to 1, but it still kinda works as almost like a 5-1 resolution in reverse. It's weaker than an authentic cadence, but that weakness is actually a kind of strength. It doesn't give you the same clear sense of finality, so you can do it over and over without creating awkward stopping points, making it perfect for chord loops, which, oh yeah, isn't that what this video is supposed to be about? Alright, so let's take a look at some classic loops. Probably the most famous is the doo-wop changes, and this follows our classical rules nicely. These first two chords are tonic, the 4 is subdominant, and the 5 is dominant. This is exactly what we'd expect to see, but if we take this structure and apply it to another popular loop, the 4-chord progression, things get complicated. Suddenly we have the 5 chord in a tonic position, the 6 is subdominant, and the 4 is dominant? That's not right. Now, we can just about rearrange these functions into a new model, one that still makes a fair amount of sense, especially if we're cool with plagal cadences, but the cracks in this approach are starting to show, and by the time we get to a loop like the Pixies' Where Is My Mind, or Radiohead's Creep, It becomes really hard to label these chords with functions that even remotely describe what they're actually doing, and Tagg argues that that's because we've missed the point. We're treating these loops as if they're trying to lead us somewhere, but they're not. They're already exactly where they want to be. So how do we model that? Well, first things first, we're gonna need some new functions. Tagg labels the 4 parts of the loop as the tonic, outgoing, medial, and incoming chords, but naming things isn't the same as analyzing them, so what do these functions do? Well, basically, this is a fancier version of the shuttle idea from earlier. The tonic and medial chords are the 2 poles of our harmonic space, while the incoming and outgoing chords serve to set them up. But how do you set up a chord? There's a couple ways. The first is stepwise motion. You take a chord, then slide it up or down a little bit to create a sense of arrival. We can see this, for instance, in Creep, where the outgoing B major slides up to the medial C major. The other main approach is dominant motion, where we move up or down by a perfect fifth. Fifths are very strong intervals, and we've been trained to hear them as resolutions. That's the foundation for both the authentic cadence and the plagal cadence. We can see this again in Creep, where the incoming C minor does a plagal resolution to the tonic G, and it also pops up in Where Is My Mind for both the outgoing and incoming approaches. Of course, not every loop has these obvious setups. In the doo-wop changes, we see that while the incoming chord sets up the tonic, the outgoing chord doesn't really set up the medial chord. It's moving by third, which is relatively weak and doesn't give us much of a sense of landing. In fact, instead of being set up by the outgoing chord, the medial chord is actually setting up the incoming chord by step, which means it's not really serving as an opposite pole at all. In this progression, medial function is subverted in order to more strongly emphasize the tonic. This isn't a 2-root system, which helps explain why traditional functional harmony does such a good job modeling it. In fact, from my own observations, it seems pretty common for the medial chord to set up the incoming one, even when it's also getting set up by the outgoing chord. I think it's a way of differentiating it from the tonic, creating a real root which doesn't go anywhere, and then a secondary passing root still stable but also subservient. We see this in Where Is My Mind, where the medial G sharp slides up a half step to the incoming A, and it also pops up in one of the most underappreciated 4-chord loops in modern rock, the plagal cascade, heard in songs like Linkin Park's What I've Done, Green Day's Boulevard of Broken Dreams, and Imagine Dragons' Radioactive, among many others. It's basically just a series of plagal resolutions with each chord setting up the next, except for the tonic, which moves to the outgoing chord by third, thus establishing itself as the end of the harmonic road. But even fairly simple progressions can make a lot more sense when viewed through this lens. Tagg cites the Trog's Wild Thing, where traditional functional harmony would tell us that this dominant 5 chord is being subverted by an interrupting subdominant 4, but the loop model tells a very different story. Here, the 5 chord isn't really dominant at all, it's just serving as a secondary musical location which we transition into and out of via the 4 chord. In this case, the tonic is still stronger, so we hear the whole thing in a single key, but the 5 isn't a directional sound, it's just another place to be. This progression also highlights another important aspect of Tagg's theory. If a chord is doing more than one job, it's more important to the sound of the progression. In Wild Thing, the D chord is both incoming and outgoing, which means it's controlling all the motion of the loop. On the other hand, Sweet Home Alabama has G as both its medial and incoming chords, strengthening it so that it takes on an almost equivalent level of tonal weight to the tonic D, and if you've been around music theory circles or just watched the video I did a couple weeks ago, you'll know that there's a lot of ambiguity about which key this song is in. Tagg says it's in D because that's in the tonic position, but the fact that G does so much of the functional heavy lifting is a large part of why that's hard to nail down. However, Tagg also argues against the idea that the first chord in the loop must necessarily be the tonic. Here, he cites the Beatles' With a Little Help from My Friends, where we see 2 consecutive plagal resolutions setting up a return to the 1 chord in the 3rd position. Here, the loop is perhaps better understood as starting on the medial and then working its way back to the tonic. There's also the chorus loop from Hurt, which starts on the outgoing chord, saving the tonic for last. We're dealing with loops here going round and round in a big harmonic circle, so it kinda doesn't matter where we start. The chords will always fall in the same order. So if it's not always the first chord, how do we know which one the tonic is? Well, that all comes down to listening, but to help us out, Tagg offers 5 things to look for. First, is there another progression elsewhere in the song that might help us contextualize what we're hearing? Second, does the song end on a specific point in the loop in a way that sounds like a satisfying resting place? Third, are there any rhythmic or melodic clues in the way the loop is played that help set up one chord more than the others. Fourth, is there a chord with more than one function in the loop, especially if it's the first or last one played? And fifth, does the song come from a tradition in which some tonal configurations are just more common than others? None of these will, on their own, guarantee that you found the correct tonic chord, but honestly, if you really can't figure it out, there's always another option. Maybe there is no single tonic. Much like in Great Gig in the Sky, the tonic and medial chords may just be so similar in weight that determining which one is which is impossible and, more importantly, unhelpful. Ultimately, I think the point of Tagg's model is similar to an argument I made in my initial video. A lot of loops aren't really best understood as belonging to a larger tonality. They're their own self-contained thing, governed less by functional obligations and more by a series of transitions. When you're looking at a loop, the best question you can ask yourself isn't what key you're in, it's how the different chords are setting each other up. Of course, just like any other theoretical model, Tagg's loop functions shouldn't be treated as a template. There's no one right way to write a chord loop, and you'll always find exceptions. But it's a much more flexible model than functional harmony, and it does a really good job explaining a pretty wide variety of songs. The four-chord loop is one of the staples of modern harmony, but if you want to turn your loop into a song, you're gonna need production skills too, and Skillshare's got lots of great classes to help with that. I'd especially recommend a course called Inside the Studio, which they made in collaboration with Grammy-winning producer Focus. He takes you through his process of collaborating with artists, making and polishing tracks, and all sorts of other skills a producer needs in order to make their best music. If you want to check that out, Skillshare's even offering 2 free months of premium access to the first 500 12-tone viewers to click the link in the description. It comes with complete access to all their amazing courses on music production, songwriting, and lots of different instruments, along with plenty of other skills a working musician might need like marketing, organization, and design. And if you like what you see, sticking around is super affordable with premium plans starting under $10 a month, so why not give Skillshare a shot? Anyway, thanks for watching, thanks to our Patreon patrons for making these videos possible, and extra special thanks to this video's featured patrons, Susan Jones and Jill Sundgaard. If you want to help out and help us pick the next song we analyze too, there's a link to our Patreon on screen now. You can also join our mailing list to find out about new episodes, like, share, comment, subscribe, and above all, keep on rockin'.